Ancient mariners spoke of golden cities that never existed, and modern treasure hunters chased dreams of pirate gold that was never buried. Welcome to Chapter 7 of The Rise the Limit, Gold Fever, Pirate Myths, Molasses Reef. After yesterday's encounter with Calico Jack's legendary waters and that persistent barracuda, we trace the origins of treasure obsession from Columbus's first whispers of a gold-rich island called Babec to the disappointing reality that pirates spent their plunder in taverns, not buried it in romantic caches. The real treasure story begins in the 1970s with a shipwreck that initially frustrated commercial hunters, but ultimately rewrote the definition of what makes something truly valuable. Gold Fever, Pirate Myths, Molasses Reef. The X on a map that remains a mystery. The romantic vision of a one-eyed rogue burying a chest of gold is largely a marketing fiction cooked up by Robert Louis Stevenson. My research into this discrepancy, conducted between sips of a drink the color of antifreeze, revealed the brutal truth about pirate economics. The life of a buccaneer was nasty, brutish, and short, and their financial strategy reflected this reality. These were not men who contributed to a 401k. They were proponents of a radical spend-down plan, converting every captured coin into rum and revelry at the earliest opportunity in ports like Nassau or Port Royal. A pirate's portfolio was liquid, chiefly in the 80-proof sense. Furthermore, a pirate captain shouting that they had struck gold was likely being poetic. A successful raid usually yielded items that are conspicuously difficult to bury. Blackbeard would have struggled to find a suitable hiding spot on a deserted quay for 1,000 barrels of sugar, a shipment of lumber, or 50 bolts of fine English cloth. The logistics are a nightmare. This wasn't treasure, it was cargo. Merchandise to be fenced quickly. The pirate code itself, the Articles of Agreement, insisted that all plunder be shared immediately among the crew. There was no massive, consolidated fund for a captain to hide, which explains the distinct lack of pirate-themed mutual funds today. The global fantasy, the whole industry of maps with dotted lines and shovels marked X, stands on the shoulders of one man, Captain William Kidd. Kidd did, in fact, bury a small hoard on Gardiner's Island, New York, just before he was caught and sent to the gallows in 1701. That single documented case of a pirate making a deposit in a terrestrial savings account sparked a 3-century fever. He was the one-hit wonder whose track became the anthem for generations of hopefuls with metal detectors. My quest for glittering loot was, therefore, a bust. Yet the islands do harbour a treasure, though it appeals more to men with elbow patches on their blazers than to swashbucklers. In the 1970s, divers discovered the Molasses Reef Wreck, the oldest known European shipwreck in the Americas. It was not a pirate sloop, but a Spanish or Portuguese caravel from the dawn of exploration, dating to the early 1500s. The recovered artifacts, early cannons, carpenter's tools, pottery, are historically priceless. They offer a unique look into the first European ventures into the New World. To an archaeologist, this is the real prize. It is strictly a matter of perspective. One man's priceless historical artifact is another man's thing you can't use to pay for dinner. The clink of ice against my glass brought me back to the present. The real treasure, it seems, is rarely gold. Sometimes it is a cracked piece of 500-year-old pottery. Sometimes it is just knowing the difference. Unveiling Molasses Reef, Europe's oldest American wreck. That distinction was lost on the group of treasure hunters who began zipping around the local reefs in the 1970s. They operated with the kind of single-minded optimism fueled by visions of gold bars and jewel-encrusted goblets. When they located a wreck on Molasses Reef, they likely believed they had hit the jackpot, but as they hauled up the contents, their celebration curdled. There was no gold and no silver. They found only a pile of chunky, primitive cannons, some rusty tools, and a collection of clay pots. It was the maritime equivalent of expecting a Porsche for your 16th birthday and getting a bus pass. What these fortune seekers dismissed as historic junk, archaeologists soon recognized as the oldest known European shipwreck in the Americas, dating between 1495 and 1515. This was not a lumbering treasure galleon from the later golden age of piracy. It was a caravel, the rugged, no-frills pickup truck of the sea that defined the dawn of European exploration. It was a floating time capsule from an era so early it barely knew it was an era. The discovery ignited a conflict over ownership. The hunters, smarting from the lack of portable wealth, intended to sell off their findings piece by piece. The Turks and Caicos government, recognizing they were sitting on a site more valuable than bullion, fought to preserve it. The ensuing legal battle established a vital precedent. A nation's sunken history belongs to its people, not to the first arrival with a metal detector. Because of that ruling, the real prize, a collection of exquisitely preserved ordinary objects, now sits behind glass in the National Museum. There are early breech-loading cannons, called bombardettas, which resembled crude, angry metal pipe bombs. Nearby lay a ship's carpenter's toolkit, a disturbingly complete set that spoke of a desperate need to perform surgery on a wooden patient miles from any shore. There were also stout Spanish olive jars used for hauling water and food across an ocean that was, for all the crew knew, infinite. The carbon dating of the Molasses Reef Wreck places it a few years after that famous 1492 voyage. Connecting this pile of timber to Columbus is the historical equivalent of finding a blurry photo of a pigeon and declaring you have found a living pterodactyl. The ship remains anonymous. It was one of countless vessels that sailed into the unknown, crewed not by legendary admirals but by likely terrified sailors. What sits in the museum isn't the highlight reel of a famous man, but the unedited footage of everyday life and technology from the precise moment two worlds collided. It is a treasure not of the exceptional, but of the typical. The Phantom Island of Golden Dreams. The obsession with linking that anonymous pile of timber to the Pinta remains strong, mostly because we prefer famous ghosts to anonymous laborers. But the Pinta did not sink here. Its captain, Martín Alonso Pinzón, had far grander plans for maritime disaster. He was consumed by a quest for Bábec, a phantom island of gold whose exact location lay somewhere at the intersection of a language barrier and a fever dream, just east of desperation and slightly north of mutiny. The local Lucayan Taíno people, through a series of gestures the Spanish interpreted with the boundless optimism of gold-addled prospectors, had pointed east. They described a place where gold was allegedly so common one had to sweep it off the porch. For the crew of a high-risk transatlantic venture backed by investors who demanded a return, this was less a rumor and more a business plan sent from heaven. The siren song of Bábec proved to be the breaking point for the famously fragile partnership between Columbus and Pinzón, leading the latter to peel off in a solo pursuit of the jackpot. Bábec did not exist. At least, not as a gleaming treasure island. It might have been a simple misunderstanding where the Taíno described Hispaniola and the Spanish heard streets paved with unearned wealth. It could have been a specific Taíno myth, their own Atlantis. Or, my personal favorite theory, it was a masterful act of customer service. The Taíno quickly figured out what these loud, metal-clad tourists wanted and simply pointed them toward the horizon to get them to leave. It was the 15th century equivalent of telling a difficult customer the item they want is in the back, then waiting in the stockroom until they go away. Pinzón's treasure hunt was a spectacular failure, but the story of Bábec wasn't an ending. It was the pilot episode for a franchise of mass delusion that would dominate the Americas for the next century. El Dorado became the blockbuster sequel, an idea so powerful it drove men to perform incredible feats of endurance and even more incredible acts of cruelty. The legend's origin, fittingly, wasn't a place, but a person. El Dorado, the Gilded One. The ceremony was a factual muisca tradition in the Colombian Andes. To anoint a new chief, the tribe would slather him in clay and blow gold dust over his body until he looked like a living Oscar statue. He would raft to the center of Lake Guatavita and dive in as an offering to the gods, while his subjects tossed in gold and emeralds. When the Spanish witnessed this, the story went through their rumor mill and emerged completely transformed. The Gilded Man became a lost city of pure gold, a jungle Las Vegas with better resale value. This fairy tale launched decades of brutal, pointless expeditions. Conquistadors like Gonzalo Pizarro marched armies into the Amazon, where they were destroyed by starvation and disease while chasing a ghost. Pizarro's failure, however, had an astonishing side effect. His lieutenant, Francisco de Orellana, figured that since he could not go back, he might as well go forward. He continued downriver and accidentally completed the first European navigation of the entire Amazon River, a monumental geographic discovery born from a spectacularly failed treasure hunt. The fever spread north under a different brand name, the 7 Cities of Cibola. This particular fantasy of golden cities shimmering in the desert convinced Francisco Vázquez de Coronado to lead a massive army from 1540 to 1542 across the American Southwest. He marched through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Kansas. He found no gold. What he found were the Zuni people's adobe pueblos, which, if you squinted just right in the setting sun, might have looked vaguely golden. It was the historical equivalent of ordering a filet mignon and being served a potato. These quests were never just about adventure. They were high-stakes business ventures. Every conquistador was an aspiring startup founder looking for a fat exit. A myth like El Dorado was the pitch deck used to recruit men and raise money for an entrada into uncharted territory. The risk was total ruin, but the potential reward was a fortune that could make kings jealous. This obsession with phantom cities reveals that the most powerful force in the age of discovery wasn't gunpowder or the compass. It was the unshakable belief that just around the corner lay a shortcut to unimaginable wealth, a belief that more often than not led directly off a cliff. How 2 staggering jackpots fueled a century of fever. The relentless pursuit of phantom islands like Babek feels like a fever dream. Whatever drove generations of men to march into malarial swamps and face indigenous arrows seems at a glance like mass delusion. Yet to understand the obsessive, century-long hunt for El Dorado, one must recognize that it was not merely a fantasy. It was a business plan, justified by 2 of the most spectacular earnings reports in human history. The quest for a third golden empire was driven by recent precedent. Before the 1520s, the Spanish presence in the Americas had been a break-even affair. A few gold trinkets here, a tobacco leaf there, just enough to keep royal investors from liquidating the enterprise. Then Hernán Cortés marched into Mexico. His expedition against the Aztec Empire in 1521 was less an exploration and more a hostile takeover. He toppled an entire civilization and looted its central bank. The sheer tonnage of bullion shipped back to Spain delivered an economic shockwave, definitively proving that a small, violently ambitious group of entrepreneurs could become richer than kings. The bar for a successful quarter had been reset. If Cortés wrote the playbook, Francisco Pizarro perfected it. Inspired by the Aztec windfall, he took his own venture south to Peru in 1533, targeting the even wealthier Inca Empire. Pizarro's masterstroke was capturing the emperor Atahualpa, which precipitated the most famous ransom negotiation on record. Atahualpa, misreading his captor's intentions, offered to fill a large chamber once with gold and twice with silver in exchange for his release. One can imagine Pizarro feigning contemplation while calculating his cut, eventually agreeing to the terms. The Inca people delivered. They brought statues, jewelry, and plates, a nation's entire artistic and sacred heritage, and piled it high. Pizarro, in a move that would get him promoted in some modern venture capital firms, took the treasure and had the emperor garroted anyway. These two jackpots warped the European perception of reality. Suddenly, no story was too ridiculous. Another empire made entirely of gold? Why not? A city where emeralds were used as doorstops? Seems plausible. This was the proof of concept that launched 1,000 doomed ships. The staggering success of Cortés and Pizarro became the only outcome anyone saw. A cognitive bias so powerful it fueled a speculative mania for 100 years. It was akin to living in a world where the first two people to buy lottery tickets won the multi-state jackpot. Suddenly, buying a ticket didn't look like a gamble, but a mandatory financial strategy. The fallout was a self-perpetuating cycle of failure. When the next conquistador stumbled out of the jungle, broke and starving, he could not simply admit there was nothing there. To save face and secure funding for a second round, he would return with whispers of a new, even grander city just over the next mountain range. This fever produced a grim paradox. The Spanish viewed the intricate goldwork of the Aztecs and Incas not as priceless art, but as raw commodity. They melted down irreplaceable cultural treasures into crude ingots, systematically destroying the very history they had found. The two greatest discoveries in the New World effectively guaranteed that for the next century, almost everyone who followed would discover nothing but misery, all while erasing anything beautiful they happened to find along the way. The timeless lure of jackpots and bullion. We remember the legends of Cortés and Pizarro only because they won. Their success broadcast across the Spanish Empire like a winning lottery number, drowning out the reality of the odds. History rarely erects monuments to the thousands of anonymous men erased by fever, starvation, or a well-aimed arrow from a defender who reasonably objected to having his empire dismantled. The human mind is a terrible statistician. It clings to the outlier and mistakes it for the norm. The aspiring conquistador never pictured himself as one of the 999 failures rotting in the undergrowth. He saw himself as the next Cortés, already practicing his signature on the deed to a palace. This fixation explains not just the search, but the blindness. The invasion was less a military conflict than an argument over the definition of value, and the side with the arquebuses determined the winner. To the Spaniard, a golden mask was a ledger entry. Its worth was purely weight, raw material to be melted, stamped, and shipped. The intricate workmanship was a bug, not a feature, an inconvenient reminder of the pagan hands that shaped it. To the indigenous craftsman, that mask was a conduit to the divine, a masterpiece of sacred geometry. The result was a tragedy of accounting. The invaders treated irreplaceable heritage as a liquidity event. It was the historical equivalent of sending efficiency experts to the Louvre with a crucible, tasking them to convert the Mona Lisa into a stack of tradable assets. The German artist Albrecht Dürer was one of the few Europeans to witness the early Aztec shipments before the furnaces did their work. Confronted with the alien beauty of the loot, he did not see bullion. He saw the subtle ingenuity of men in distant lands. He was a rare witness who appreciated the artistry even as the administration prepared to melt down the history of a civilization. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 7, Gold Fever, Pirate Myths, Molasses Reef. The Spanish obsession with mythical gold may have driven centuries of exploration, but true treasure turned out to be the cultural artifacts and historical understanding we almost lost in the pursuit of precious metals. Next time, we'll follow a small fish's struggle against the current as we journey from Providenciales to Grand Turk, where a different kind of economic transformation awaits. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conquest and Consequence. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Sometimes paradise comes with a price tag that extends far beyond the hotel bill. Chapter 8. Flight over Turks and Caicos, Forbidden Conch Shells, explores what happens when economic policies designed to protect local interests create an environment where deception becomes commonplace. For 3 centuries, these islands thrived on salt production under Bermudian colonial families, but the industry's 1960s collapse forced a dramatic pivot to tourism that transformed the social fabric and left native islanders as minorities in their own homeland. What our traveler discovered in a seemingly innocent shell transaction would shatter any illusions about tropical honesty. Flight over Turks and Caicos, Forbidden Conch Shells. The island hop to the nation's heart. Quiet contemplation of the sunrise was the goal. A vicious, waterlogged gangster film was what the ocean delivered. Following my unsettlingly personal encounter with a barracuda the previous day, I had hoped for a morning of peace. Instead, I became the sole audience for a life-or-death drama starring another barracuda, possibly a cousin to my stalker, locked in pursuit of a single small plump fish. This survivalist, however, had a strategy. To escape the toothed torpedo, he launched himself out of the water and onto the beach, a tiny gilled refugee seeking asylum on a continent of sand. The barracuda would halt in the shallows, cold eyes fixed on the shore in a proper standoff. After a moment of frantic flopping, the little fish would attempt a mad dash back to the surf, only to have the predator lunge again, forcing the fugitive to repeat his desperate, sandy ballet. The situation deteriorated further when a second, smaller barracuda arrived, establishing its own armed checkpoint a few feet away. The little fish had fled one tyrant's territory only to trespass into another's. Against all odds, the plucky protagonist eventually spotted a momentary lapse in traffic and made a clean getaway, leaving the 2 predators to ponder the breakfast that might have been. They ignored a passing school of lesser, more convenient fish, having developed a fixation on the one morsel worthy of a vendetta. That little fish, desperately trying to cross a few feet of hostile territory, had learned a fundamental truth about the Turks and Caicos. This is a place where roads do not lead to Rome. In fact, most roads lead to a swamp or simply stop. Many of the larger cays are uninhabited, mosquito-infested wetlands that remain defiantly inconvenient. I am certain some forward-thinking developer will eventually drain the swamp of East Caicos, rename it the Estates at Mosquito Preserve, and introduce genetically modified super predators to eradicate the dengue carriers. Until then, the geography remains stubborn. This disconnect defines the 2 sides of the nation. Getting from the modern tourist machine of Providenciales to the historic capital, Cockburn Town on Grand Turk, is an exercise in applied logistics. With no ferry service, the open ocean makes such a crossing impractical and terrifying. The only reliable bridge is a short domestic flight. The trip is handled by Inter-Caribbean and Caicos Express, the airborne workhorses of the archipelago. From the whine of the turboprops firing up at Providenciales International Airport, PLS, the journey is brief but spectacular. The flight lasts only 30 minutes, offering a low-altitude view over the impossible turquoise of the Caicos Bank before crossing the deep royal blue of the Columbus Passage. This oceanic rift separates the island groups. And the dark water below is the same channel Martín Alonso Pinzón crossed when he deserted Columbus to chase rumors of gold. His defection set a precedent for the grand, foolhardy ambitions that would define the region for centuries. Once the plane touches down at Jags McCartney International Airport, GDT, on Grand Turk, the pace of life decelerates instantly. The air is quieter, the buildings show their age, and the traffic shifts from SUVs to golf carts. Salt story: shifting shores, swelling strangers. The deceleration feels like time travel. How does one half of a tiny nation get shot into the 21st century like a cannonball, while the other is left behind to gather dust, a museum piece commemorating itself? The answer, like the barracuda I saw chasing that poor fish earlier this morning, is a story of single-minded appetite. For nearly 300 years, that appetite was for salt. The Turks and Caicos Islands were, for most of their modern history, a company town, and the company mineral was sodium chloride. Bermudian colonists arrived in the late 17th century and saw the natural salt pans not as a curiosity but as a cash register. They established a ruling class of salt proprietors on Grand Turk and Salt Cay, men who controlled the flow of white gold and, by extension, everything else. Their legacy survives in the bleached white Bermudian architecture of Cockburn Town, elegant and stiff, reminiscent of a dowager duchess who refuses to admit the party ended 70 years ago. But the party did end. By the mid-20th century, the global salt market had all the appeal of a fad diet, and the island's industry, riddled with inefficiencies, collapsed. It was an economic meteor strike. The great salt families, Astwood, Harriet, whose names were once stamped on every major enterprise, saw their fortunes evaporate. With no other prospects, they scattered, heading for careers in the UK, Canada, and the US. They left only a few descendants to tend the ashes, some of whom now run historic guest houses, shifting from salt merchants to innkeepers. When a nation's only industry vanishes, the silence is deafening. The government, faced with this void, made a decision of either breathtaking genius or spectacular desperation. They pivoted to tourism. This was not a gentle suggestion. It was a Hail Mary pass aimed at the wallets of the world's wealthy. In Robinson Crusoe, Daniel Defoe noted his castaway hero's ambition was to be master of the whole island. In the 1970s, the TCI government essentially put the whole island of Providenciales up for grabs, hoping a new kind of master would appear. The solution was to pivot to high-end tourism on Providenciales. It worked. The resort fired the starting pistol for a development race that transformed Provo from a deserted backwater into a global brand. It also ignited a demographic explosion. An island nation of about 5,000 people suddenly saw its population multiply by nearly 800% in less than 2 generations. This was not organic growth. It was a human flash flood. The demand for construction and hospitality workers wildly outpaced the local supply, so the floodgates opened to foreign labor. Today, the native-born belongers, the descendants of the salt rakers and boat builders, are a minority in their own country. They are outnumbered 2-to-1 by a vast, vital immigrant community from Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and the Philippines. One nation was built by Bermudians extracting salt from the earth for a distant empire. The new nation is being built by a global workforce extracting cash from tourists for a different kind of empire. Islands bond, Britain's broad benevolence. Standing on Grace Bay, where the sand is so white it ruins camera exposure settings and the water looks computer-generated, the geopolitical machinery behind the view is invisible. It is easy to forget about governance when the primary concern is sunscreen application. Yet, the more I looked at the glossy surface of this tourism economy, the more I realized the Turks and Caicos Islands operate on a principle that would confound a Silicon Valley founder. It is a startup that purposefully chose not to go public, opting instead for permanent supervision from its old colonial parent, the United Kingdom. The arrangement is a magnificent paradox. The head of state is King Charles III, a man whose profile appears on more tourist shop tea towels here than on the actual currency. He is represented by a governor, an official appointed by London who functions less like a friendly ambassador and more like a corporate CEO with veto power. This governor handles the expected portfolio of defense and foreign relations, ensuring the TCI does not invade the Bahamas on a whim. But he also holds the keys to the police force and possesses a break glass in case of emergency authority to suspend the local government. It is a living, breathing safety net. The UK retains the ultimate tool to prevent the territory from going completely off the rails. This strange dependence is driven by bone-deep pragmatism. For the investors pouring concrete for the gleaming resorts along the shore, the most valuable commodity is stability. The British flag overhead acts as a security blanket, a guarantee that a multi-million-dollar condo hotel will not be nationalized by a leader in military fatigues who has just seized power. This explains why, despite the fierce British political alignment, the official currency is the US dollar. It is a tacit admission that while London holds the Constitution, Washington holds the customers. The British safety net is not merely theoretical. Between 2003 and 2009, during the premiership of Michael Missick, the islands experienced an economic explosion fueled by what a UK-led inquiry later characterized as a high probability of systemic corruption and political amorality. The allegations centered on the sale of Crown land, suggesting public assets were treated as personal property. The situation deteriorated until 2009, when Britain triggered its emergency powers, suspended self-government, and imposed direct rule from London. It was a drastic, humiliating intervention, the political equivalent of a parent grounding a child and changing the locks on the apartment. When local control was finally restored in 2012, it came with a new constitution packed with stronger oversight. The subsequent investigations and trials cost local taxpayers an estimated $100 million, a biblical sum to pay for the privilege of prosecuting one's own former leaders. This leaves the fundamental bargain of the Turks and Caicos exposed. The territory has traded a measure of pure freedom for a guarantee of stability, choosing the steady hand of a distant kingdom over the unpredictable passions of absolute self-rule. In a world full of nations struggling with their own independence, is that a failure of nerve or simply good business? Coral cost. Crime's cold call. While the United Kingdom provides a constitutional backstop against political collapse, the local government maintains a far more intricate safety net for the employment market. This manifests in a policy known as belonger preference. By law, any native-born citizen must be offered a position before an employer can even consider an immigrant application. In theory, it is a tool of economic empowerment. In practice, it ensures that your cousin who once made a passable daiquiri at a family reunion has a legal claim to the head bartender position at a five-star resort. The policy has cleaved the workforce in two. The visible roles, concierges, servers, and anyone positioned to receive a tip in distinctively air-conditioned lobbies, are filled by belongers. Meanwhile, the heavy lifting falls to a vast, largely invisible class of imported laborers. Walking past construction sites or peering into the service entrances of hotels reveals a demographic shift. The hard labor of landscaping and industrial laundry is handled by guest workers from Haiti, the Philippines, and beyond. This structure ultimately bears a striking resemblance to the guest worker economy of Dubai, creating a society where a minority of citizens holds political leverage, while a transient majority keeps the physical plant running. For the visitor, this protectionism imposes an unseen tariff on experience. By insulating the local workforce from competition, the policy weakens the feedback loop essential to a service economy. There is little penalty for apathy when the law guarantees your tenure. The consequence is the service often encountered on Providenciales, a $28 hamburger delivered with the same enthusiasm a tired sea lion shows for a tourist taking its picture. The issue runs deeper than efficient table service. It erodes the fundamental trust required for commerce. I learned this on the sands of Grace Bay during an incident involving a particularly beautiful queen conch shell. A friendly vendor approached me, offering the pink spiraled souvenir for a reasonable price. The transaction seemed straightforward, a classic exchange of cash for local color. What the vendor omitted, with the practiced silence of a seasoned grifter, is that the queen conch is an endangered species protected by CITES regulations. Attempting to export that unprocessed shell through the airport would not result in a fond farewell, but an introduction into a small room with serious customs officers, followed by confiscation and heavy fines. The market here is not merely unregulated, it is predatory. The vendor's profit relied entirely on my ignorance of international wildlife law. It was a deceptive, zero-sum game designed to separate a fool from his money, and it succeeded in shattering my trust in the open market of Grace Bay. This friction defines the two distinct worlds of the Turks and Caicos. Grace Bay is the bazaar, dynamic, messy, and riddled with low-level hustles and housing shortages caused by inflated land values. It offers immense choice provided you are willing to navigate the unpredictability. Then there is Ambergris Cay, the walled garden of billionaires. It functions as a closed loop, a highly curated bubble where the high cost of entry purchases immunity from the hustles. The all-inclusive rate comes with a strict no-tipping policy, removing the awkward calculus of gratuities. From the private airstrip to the isolated villas, the service is flawless because the system is engineered to be frictionless. The premium paid is not for better sand or clearer water, but for the absence of annoyance. It is a world where no one tries to sell you contraband seashells. My expedition into the mechanics of this island nation resolved into a single economic truth. The ultimate luxury is not gold plumbing or thread count. It is predictability. It is the astronomically expensive privilege of knowing exactly what will happen next. Regarding the service staff at Ambergris Cay, I was reminded of Adam Smith. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Sometimes the most beautiful destinations hide the most uncomfortable truths, and the Turks and Caicos certainly proved that point. There's something unsettling about discovering that paradise comes with its own set of deceptions, but perhaps that's what makes travel so essential. It strips away our assumptions one conch shell at a time. Next time, we're diving deep into the layers of history beneath these sun-bleached islands, from ancient Mer traders to indigenous peoples, and somehow we'll end up with SpaceX rocket debris on a beach named after a slave trader. Trust me, you won't see that connection coming. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conch and Consequence. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Until next time, keep questioning what lies beneath the surface. Continuing our journey on The Rise the Limit, we move from the economic complexities and tourist paradoxes of Providenciales to Chapter 9, From Myrrh to Musk in Turks and Caicos. After experiencing the deceptive conch shell transaction that soured our travelers' view of the main tourist areas, we follow them to the more controlled environment of Ambergris Caye, where a simple golf cart exploration with their son reveals unexpected connections between ancient botanical commerce and modern space debris. What begins as quiet observations of desert flora evolves into a meditation on how this remote limestone platform has witnessed everything from indigenous Lucayan settlements to contemporary luxury development. From myrrh to musk in Turks and Caicos, the scent of ancient empires and sacred texts. The local ducks proved to be zealous colonialists. Having survived a rather personal encounter with a barracuda the day before, I had expected a peaceful morning swim. Instead, I found our pool annexed, transformed into a private waterfowl bathhouse without so much as a referendum. While my son and I awaited the arrival of French toast, we conducted a brief zoological survey of the dry deck. First on the agenda were the resident iguanas, sunning themselves with the lethargy of retired senators. Then we noticed a detail that short-circuited the brain. Someone, a person of either breathtaking audacity or profound ignorance, had tagged the endangered reptiles with a Sharpie. Numbers were scrawled directly onto their scales, cataloguing them like office supplies. Breakfast perhaps concluded, we requisitioned a golf cart of questionable horsepower and set out to survey the island. It is a large, dry place, a Caribbean desert of scrub and sand where the heat lays heavy on the skin. We stopped to inspect the local flora, specifically the Turk's head cactus, which stands stout and spiky. Its peculiar red top looks uncannily like a shriner's fez. Upon this crimson cap sat little pink pepper-like fruits, a favorite snack for the local lizards and birds. They eat, they fly, they deposit seeds elsewhere, the circle of life delivered by airmail. Nearby stood another interesting plant. Thanks to Google Lens, I identified the shrub as something entirely unexpected, a member of the Commiphora genus. This plant family is the sainted source of myrrh. Seeing it here in the New World scrub felt incongruous, as its resin was, for antiquity, a substance more precious than reason. For thousands of years, myrrh and its cousin frankincense were luxury goods whose price tags made gold look like a stocking stuffer. This sap was the scent of power, the perfume of queens, the holy incense that filled temples, and a first-rate antiseptic used to dress wounds. Most critically, it was used to pickle pharaohs for their long journey into the afterlife. The three magi didn't just grab a few things from the Jericho duty-free. Presenting myrrh to the infant Jesus was the ancient equivalent of handing over the keys to a kingdom. The demand for this resin created the world's first great supply chains, a veritable incense route that made Arabia rich. The oil industry of the ancient world, only it smelled better. The ancient limestone foundation of a modern paradise. Pocketing my phone and leaving the ancient incense route behind, I looked down at the scrubby ground beneath the golf cart's wheels. The discovery of Old World botany in a New World desert prompted a more fundamental question. What precisely was this place built on? From where did this stage arise, upon which invasive ducks colonize swimming pools and lizards snack on fez-shaped cacti? It was an inquiry into the very bedrock of the vacation. To understand the ground here, one must banish all thoughts of dramatic, fire-belching volcanoes. The creation of these islands was a less theatrical affair, a story of biology and chemistry waged on a timescale that makes ancient empires look like fleeting fads. The Turks and Caicos are not mountains of fire, but mountains of life. They are the exposed top floors of a titanic 3-mile-high limestone skyscraper built by the quiet, tireless work of countless dead microorganisms. It is the largest, most successful construction project ever undertaken by creatures without brains, opposable thumbs, or a basic understanding of building permits. The story began in the age of the dinosaurs, a period of extraordinarily poor career prospects for mammals, but excellent ones for shellfish. This entire region was a shallow, warm sea, and for tens of millions of years, an unfathomable number of corals, algae, and mollusks lived, died, and sank. Their tiny calcium carbonate skeletons rained down in a gentle, perpetual blizzard of death, piling up layer after agonizing layer. As the sea floor slowly subsided under the weight, the frantic biological accumulation kept pace, a race between gravity and reproduction, ensuring the water remained shallow. This created a foundation of solid limestone so thick that it could serve as the plot for a geologist's most ambitious dreams. After 100 million years of this diligent, if monotonous, biological masonry, the planet attempted some aggressive redecorating. During the Great Ice Ages, so much of the world's water became locked in glaciers that the sea level dropped by 400 feet. This drainage exposed the entire limestone platform as two colossal, blindingly white islands. Nature, acting as a particularly unsubtle sculptor, went to work. Rain, naturally acidic, fell upon the bare limestone and dissolved it, riddling the landscape with the holes of a classic karst topography. This chemical carving created the island's extensive underworlds, like the Conch Bar caves, along with the sinkholes and blue holes that pockmark the terrain today. When the last ice age threw in the towel some 12,000 years ago, the global ice maker was shut off. The seas rose again, flooding back across the great limestone banks, drowning the vast plains and leaving only the very highest points exposed, the tips of ancient, fossilized sand dunes and reefs. These survivors, these accidental peaks, are the scattered cays that constitute the nation. The brilliant white sand of Ambergris Cay, the very stuff I was now staring at, is the final product of this saga. It is the pulverized, bleached remains of the reef a mile offshore, endlessly ground down and delivered to the beach. Much of it is simply parrotfish excrement, a fact that brings a certain level of humility to the act of building a sandcastle. The ground beneath my feet was not truly solid earth. It was a porous monument to time, a delicate crust of life and death, and I now had to decide whether to defile its 150 million year history by digging in it with a small plastic shovel. Conch Coast, Cay's cyclic calling. Against the island's 3-mile-thick geological foundation, the human footprint is barely a scratch. I had assumed the anthropological history of Ambergris Cay would pale in comparison to its biological origins, and I was right. The island's first human chapter lacks the imperial grandeur found elsewhere in the Americas. There are no stone temples or pyramids here. Instead, the archaeological record resembles a sad beige social media account, minimalist, muted, and devoid of permanent clutter. While neighboring islands were densely settled by the Lucayans, this remote cay was the cul-de-sac they visited but never moved into. That does not mean the island was a blank slate. The story is simply written in stains and discarded shucks rather than masonry. Archaeologists acting as forensic detectives have uncovered charcoal-darkened soil, the ghostly radius of a campfire lit 1,000 years ago, and small pottery sherds that prove the Lucayans broke dishware just like the rest of us. But the smoking gun is the shell. Behind the dunes lie mounds of sun-bleached queen conch, each bearing the signature kill hole. This small puncture, knocked into the shell to slice the muscle and release the meat, marks the site not as a village, but as a processing plant. Between AD 1100 and 1500, Lucayans landed their dugouts on the leeward beach, harvested the bank, and processed the catch in an industrial protein assembly line. It was a model of extraction that modern captains of industry might envy. It also brought to mind the economic irony of my own trip. I had recently paid $240 for a conch dinner, a premium markup for a creature the Lucayans pulled from the surf for free. They treated the quay as a factory floor, efficient, seasonal, and temporary. They didn't stay because they couldn't. The quay sits on the far edge of the Caicos bank, isolated and, crucially, parched. There is no reliable source of fresh water. For the Lucayans, whose expertise in their environment was absolute, this was a deal-breaker. For us, it is merely an engineering hurdle. We stare at the same arid landscape and choose to stay, sustained not by a natural spring, but by the electrical hum of a reverse osmosis plant. Hawkins' horrid heritage, sea grapes and slavers. On the blinding white sand of Ambergris Cay, my son was currently engaged in filling the void with noise, having discovered his inner barbarian. On a stretch of shoreline we would soon learn was called Hawkins Beach, he had procured a sturdy branch, a veritable club of ages, and was pummeling the inanimate world into submission. He battered unsuspecting sea grape leaves and sent innocent coconuts rolling for their lives. It was a scene straight from the dawn of man, a miniature William Golding novel minus the pig and the developing psychosis. Watching this primal display of conquest, I wondered what titan of territorial ambition this particular stretch of sand was named for. A quick check of an early 2000s digital map, a relic from before we reconsidered naming vacation spots after problematic historical figures, revealed a rogues gallery. The local cartography honored slavers like Lightbourne, colonizers like Columbus, and pirates like Anne Bonny. This specific location, however, belonged to Sir John Hawkins. The name sounded dignified, the sort of appellation that suggests high collars and noble deeds. A traveller might reasonably assume that a man knighted by Elizabeth I deserved the commemorative real estate. You would be half right, which is the most unsettling kind of right there is. Sir John Hawkins was the pioneer of the English slave trade. He was the first English captain to visit the Turks and Caicos, stopping here in 1563 while returning from selling enslaved people in Hispaniola. For Hawkins, the deep water passages of the Turks Island Passage were not a scenic backdrop, but an expressway to the lucrative markets of the Spanish Main. The islands were a strategic waypoint, a navigational necessity rather than a destination. But history rarely deals in single-issue villains. After a disastrous run-in with the Spanish ended his career in human trafficking, Hawkins pivoted. He became Treasurer of the Royal Navy, emerging as a brilliant reformer who revolutionized naval architecture. He designed a new class of race-built galleons, longer, lower, and faster than their predecessors. These innovations were not merely academic. They proved critical in 1588 when the nimble English fleet dismantled the Spanish Armada. Hawkins served as a rear admiral during the battle alongside his cousin, Sir Francis Drake, and was knighted on the deck of his flagship for his role in saving England from invasion. The man who designed the warships that preserved English sovereignty was the same man who perfected the logistics of the transatlantic slave trade. It is a dissonance akin to discovering that Thomas Jefferson also invented the pop-up ad. Hawkins's legacy is a tangle of national heroism and foundational brutality, a complexity that hangs invisible over the turquoise water. We looked down at the pristine, guiltless sand, where the only current conflict was a preteen waging war against a coconut on a beach named for a knight. Turks and Caicos, SpaceX debris and Glenn's orbit. Descending a ridge after cataloguing the island's more villainous place names, I felt we had exhausted our tour of polarizing figures. The sea, however, had other plans. It had coughed up the refuse of a newer, more contemporary rogue. Just offshore, a derelict ship listed lazily in the shallows, its cargo strangely including a rusted PT cruiser, a fine piece of scenery I initially thought would be the main event. It was not. Halfway down the path, a different shape caught my eye, hiding in the low, tough shrubbery, like a misplaced Nespresso pod for a giant. It was a large, long cylinder, tightly wrapped in the distinctive frayed black weave of carbon fiber. My mind, a finely tuned instrument for identifying high-end consumer goods, leaped to one conclusion: SpaceX. I recalled a rumor that a Falcon 9 rocket had enjoyed a brief, unscheduled disassembly about 7 months prior, treating the Western Atlantic to a fireworks display and a light shower of re-entry tiles. A bit of subsequent research confirmed the suspicion. I was dealing with a composite overwrapped pressure vessel, or COPV. In layman's terms, this is a very expensive tank designed to hold high-pressure oxygen or hydrogen, the volatile stuff that makes the big fire go up. It was more than likely spent, but banging on it with a stick seemed like a poor choice. This tank, a piece of high-tech flotsam, is the most tangible evidence of the Turks and Caicos' relationship with the heavens. The islands sit southeast of Cape Canaveral, directly under the flight path of rockets trying to escape Earth's surly bonds. From time to time, bits and pieces of Elon Musk's extraterrestrial ambitions wash up on the beaches. Usually it is a payload fairing, the giant clamshell nose cone that protects satellites, but occasionally the tide delivers a more interesting prize. It is a strange bargain. On one hand, SpaceX provides the islands with Starlink internet, a vital connection to the outside world. On the other, the company maintains the tacit right to drop a multi-million-dollar gas can on the front lawn. This is not the nation's first encounter with space exploration, though the previous era came with more pageantry. During the space race of the 1960s, NASA operated a critical missile tracking station on Grand Turk, essential for the Mercury and Apollo missions. When John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth in 1962, his first steps back on solid ground were on Grand Turk. He was given a parade, and a replica of his Friendship 7 capsule was installed at the airport. He was a hero returning to a grateful territory. Today, we get the empty containers. The arc of history has bent from state-sponsored glory to the occasional litter of private enterprise. The contrast raced through my mind as I stood on the trail, a modern traveler confronting a modern artifact. The local authorities have a clear protocol for these situations. Do not touch it. Do not move it, and call someone who knows what they are doing. The object remains the property of SpaceX, a corporation so wealthy it can afford to misplace hardware that costs more than a house. I plan to report it eventually. But first, I took another look. It is not every day you get to stand next to a piece of a modern Icarus, a reminder that even when you successfully touch the sun, you still leave a little bit of yourself behind. K-Craft. Coastal Control. I stepped away from the carbon fiber carcass of the rocket fuel tank, leaving the space junk to its slow disintegration in the scrub. Turning back toward the coast, it wasn't impossible to see the appeal of this place, even if the method of enjoying it felt jarring. Out here, where the only indigenous commerce is a hermit crab inspecting a new shell, the primary industry is now high-stakes real estate. Carving a luxury subdivision into this wild patch of fossilized coral feels aggressive, like trying to install an elevator in a cathedral. But the master plan clearly did not require my architectural sign-off. The few houses that already punctuate the coastline are vast, standing in defiant, pristine condition against an environment that typically dissolves everything with salt spray and relentless sun. Most of these structures appeared in the early 2000s, lonely monuments to a previous development cycle. Today, a new chapter is under construction, orchestrated by Waterloo Investment Holdings Limited. The name itself implies a familiarity with decisive battles. The company's chairman, Lord Michael Ashcroft, holds a comically precise 92.32% of the shares. This is not a standard open house experience. The island operates as a developer-controlled fiefdom with a single gatekeeper. The property listings read like a gift registry for a minor deity. A 3-bedroom Neptune or Poseidon villa lists for $4.45 million, a price tag that presumably includes the irony of naming a beach house after the god whose storms you will spend a fortune insuring against. For those requiring more square footage to ponder their asset allocation, the 4-bedroom Aurora oceanfront villa asks $5.15 million. It is a modern inversion of the Midas myth. Instead of a king turning objects to gold, a developer waves a hand and transforms empty limestone shoreline into a security-patrolled asset class. The entry fee is steep, but the paperwork is streamlined. Joining this club requires a purchase agreement, a construction contract, and adherence to a thick stack of governing documents that likely dictate everything down to the allowable hue of patio cushions. The government of the Turks and Caicos sweetens the transaction considerably. There is no annual property tax, no income tax, and no capital gains tax. The only significant friction is a one-time stamp duty of 10% at closing. It is a fiscal biosphere engineered for those who view taxation not as a social contract, but as an annoying subscription service they have finally managed to cancel. Standing on the dunes, I imagined the future owner of one of these palaces. They would sit on a teak veranda, glass in hand, looking out at the turquoise expanse. It is the same water that carried John Calico Jack Rackham, the same reef system that wrecked the oldest European ship in the Americas, and the same shoreline where Lucayan canoes once beached to process conch. They would own the view, the villa, and the silence. But looking at the water, it was clear what the deed excluded. You can buy the land, but you are only ever renting the history. Lignel's legacy leverages losses. The anonymity of these villas is usually the point. Standing on the dunes looking at the white fortresses, one assumes the ownership roster is guarded with the zeal of a nuclear launch code, a web of trusts and offshore entities designed to make assets as invisible as neutrinos. Most of the time, this architecture of silence holds. But every so often the system springs a leak, and on Ambergris Caye, that leak came in the form of a public court document. My digital research into the island's development stumbled upon a local Supreme Court case, a procedural squabble between the Ambergris Caye Community Association and a defendant listed as Rosebud Island Limited. The affidavit for the defense was signed by a Mr. Jean-Charles Victor Maurice Lignel, and the filing clarified that Rosebud Island Limited was essentially a trust for a media magnate, a trust named Rosebud for a media tycoon. I had to read the line twice. The universe does occasionally write its own jokes, but this one was a masterpiece of sledgehammer subtlety. The discovery sent me on a detour through the digital archives, a quest to understand the man behind the magnificent Citizen Kane reference. Jean-Charles Lignel, born in 1942 to an aviation pioneer and a newspaper heiress, was not a simple man. His career reads like a repeating opera of grand entrances and calamitous exits. It began in the 1970s when he waged a 5-year legal war against his own family to seize control of the Lyon-based newspaper Le Progrès. He won, paying a princely sum in 1979, but victory was expensive. By 1985, buried under a mountain of debt, he was forced to surrender the keys to a rival. This became his signature move, the ambitious acquisition followed by the spectacular financial faceplant. Having lost a major newspaper, he diversified. He became a founding partner in the Veterinary Centers of America, proving that a man defeated in media could find solace in the business of sick pets. He collected art with the appetite of a pharaoh, filling his homes with works by Warhol, Keith Haring, and old masters. But the art was rarely just for display. It often served as a financial instrument, collateral for the next grand scheme. His New York real estate adventure offers a perfect summary of the Lignel method. In 1996, he bought an 1865 carriage house in the West Village for under $1 million, transforming it into a private gallery with dramatic ceilings and all the trimmings of plutocratic taste. By 2007, he listed it for $20 million. It seemed a triumphant story, until the fine print surfaced. By 2018, the property was sold in a foreclosure auction for just over $8 million, swallowed by the bank to cover debts. The house had been held in a Russian doll of corporate entities, the Rosebud Trust layered within Matthews Investments Limited, within Moorgate Investments Limited, a structure so purposely opaque it could have been inked by a squid. This brings the timeline to the present, or close to it. The 80-year-old appears to be asset-rich and cash-poor, a financial state akin to owning a gold-plated mega-yacht with no fuel. The final act of this epic was not written in the Wall Street Journal but broadcast on Bravo. His daughter, Margot, 26 years young, appeared on a reality show called Real Girlfriends in Paris. In one episode, she lamented to the cameras that her allowance had been cut from $10,000 a month to $2,000. There it is. The great man, the art collector, the media warrior, a ghost in the offshore machine, boiled down to a storyline about his daughter's pinched budget. He is a man who owned Rosebud but seems to have spent a lifetime searching for it, only to find its value liquidated to cover the interest on the search party. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 9, From Myrrh to Musk in Turks and Caicos. What began as a simple golf cart ride across a sun-bleached island revealed layers of time stretching from ancient trade routes to SpaceX debris, reminding us that even the most remote places carry the weight of human ambition and consequence. Next time, we'll explore how the islands emerged from their century of desolation through salt, treasure, and the peculiar connection between a sunken Spanish galleon and the Salem witch trials in Chapter 10. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Conch and Consequence. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Until next time, this is The Rise, The Limit.